Welcome to this week's edition of Global Intelligence Weekly Wrap-Up. This is your trusted source for intelligence insight, national security analysis, and expert commentary that goes beyond the headlines. Neil Bisson is a retired CSIS intelligence officer and the director of the Global Intelligence Knowledge Network. He brings over 25 years of intelligence and law enforcement experience to unpack the world's most pressing security threats and what they mean for you, your livelihood, and your country. In this week's episode, we begin with a case that's shaking Canada's national security establishment to its core. A domestic terror plot involving Canadian Armed Forces members, explosives, and a plan to seize land in Quebec. We then move to cyberspace, where North Korean intelligence is deploying fake freelance workers to finance the regime's weapons programs, a dangerous new evolution of cyber espionage. Back at home in Canada, CSIS issues a quiet but urgent warning about a suspected Chinese intelligence operative targeting Canadian research, while China's Ministry of State Security accuses Western agencies of using sex, coercion, and psychological manipulation to recruit Chinese nationals. We round out the episode with escalating international tension as two Chinese citizens are arrested for spying on Ukraine's Neptune missile program, and Russia's sabotage campaign intensifies across Europe, raising fears of a covert war being fought on NATO soil. This is the modern battlefield, and Neil's got the briefing you won't want to miss and won't hear anywhere else. Now let's get started.
Hello, welcome back to the Global Intelligence Weekly Wrap-Up. I'm your host, Neil Bisson, a retired intelligence officer with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service and the director of the Global Intelligence Knowledge Network. During my career as an intelligence officer, I spent years recruiting sources and providing intelligence to the highest levels of the Canadian government. Now, I'm taking open source information and doing the same for you. This is your intelligence brief, identifying the threats to your country, your career, and potentially your life. As always, there's no lack of weekly news articles concerning terrorism, espionage, sabotage, and national security concerns. From Canadian Armed Forces members being charged with terrorism, to the Chinese Ministry of State Security warning citizens about Western honeypot operations, there's a lot to dive into. So let's get started. I'm going to start this week with going into a deep dive of the story that is sending shockwaves through the Canadian military. Of course, I'm talking about the disturbing case from Quebec that highlights the growing concern of ideologically motivated violent extremism within Canada's own institutions. Following a 2-year investigation, the RCMP has charged 4 men, 2 of whom are active members of the Canadian Armed Forces, in connection with an alleged extremist plot to form an anti-government militia and forcibly take possession of land in the Quebec City area. This case marks one of the most serious domestic terrorism investigations involving serving military personnel in recent history. According to the RCMP, the accused, Marc-Aurèle Chavat, Simon Angers Odette, Raphael Lagacé, and Matthew Forbes, were allegedly preparing to create a self-sufficient anti-government community through paramilitary training and armed force. This group is said to have conducted firearms, ambush, survival, and navigation exercises while also recruiting new members via social media. Charges laid include facilitating a terrorist activity, weapons possession, and violation of Explosives and Defense Production Acts. What makes this case especially alarming is the involvement of 2 serving corporals from CFB Valcartier, including Chavat and Forbes. These are individuals with institutional training, tactical knowledge, and access to military-grade equipment, transforming what might otherwise be seen as fringe extremism into a potential national security threat. The RCMP investigation began in 2023, though the group's activities reportedly date back to 2021. Police seized a staggering cache of weapons, 83 firearms, 16 explosive devices, roughly 11,000 rounds of ammunition, military equipment, night vision goggles, and nearly 130 magazines. It is one of the largest seizures in a Canadian terrorism case, suggesting significant operational readiness. This case fits into a troubling trend of extremism infiltrating the military ranks. In recent years, the Canadian Armed Forces have forced repeated scrutiny over links between personnel and extremism or hate-based movements. In 2022, the military's own advisory flagged a rise in the number of members drawn to extremist ideologies. Previous high-profile cases, like those of Patrick Matthews, a Canadian white supremacist and former armed forces reservist who was involved in a US-based neo-Nazi plot, and Corey Huron, who stormed Rideau Hall in 2020, have underscored the danger of radicalized soldiers acting independently under extremist motivations. A former CSIS analyst called this the largest seizure of weapons and components in any Canadian terrorism case. She emphasized that the volume of weaponry indicated planning for a significant event, either mass recruitment or large-scale confrontation. Barbara Perry, director of the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism, said she wasn't surprised by the charges, noting an unholy trinity of dangerous elements: access to firearms, targeted recruitment of military personnel, and deep-seated anti-government ideologies. She warned that this combination significantly amplifies the threat posed by IMVE actors. This case is a stark reminder that domestic violent extremism isn't confined to online forums or protest rallies. It can grow quickly within the ranks of our own most trusted institutions. When ideology meets tactical capability, the consequences can be severe. The scale of the weapons seized, the nature of the plot, and the involvement of serving soldiers should prompt immediate reflection across both the military and intelligence communities. I had an opportunity to speak about this to Global News, and I indicated that given Canada's focus on increasing military capacity and recruitment, this is an issue that needs to be taken very seriously, by both within the ranks and by the brass. The screening process for recruits needs more irregular and frequent screening updates to effectively weed out or identify individuals attempting to join or already in the Canadian Armed Forces who are contemplating armed insurrection against their own government. Canada must prioritize early detection, robust radicalization awareness programs within the armed forces, and a stronger vetting process. This isn't just a question of law enforcement, it's a matter of national resilience and public safety. Given the seriousness of this topic and its coverage in the media, I will continue to discuss it in our next segment. I'll return to the major national security story making headlines across Canada and beyond: the arrest of 4 men in Quebec on terrorism-related charges. According to the RCMP, and as reported in The Guardian, the group is accused of plotting to form an armed organization, rejecting the Canadian government's authority, and planning to seize property in the province by force. 2 of the accused are serving members of the Canadian Armed Forces. The case has raised serious alarm bells about ideologically motivated violent extremism and insider threat from within the military. The RCMP's Integrated National Security Enforcement Team, or INSET, in Quebec began investigating the group in 2023 after receiving intelligence suggesting the men were engaged in anti-government activity and paramilitary training. The accused reportedly conducted reconnaissance of targeted properties and practiced ambush tactics. As discussed in the last segment, police seized a staggering cache of weapons including 83 firearms, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and 16 explosive devices. To give this context, a typical platoon is made up of 28 individuals. The amount of armory in this cache of weapons was more than 2 platoons with firearms to spare. From an intelligence standpoint, this isn't just a case of domestic radicalization. This was an operational cell with a clear objective: to capture and assert control over land and territory through threat of violence and use of force. It has a pre-Waco, Texas vibe, and we all know how that ended. The planning, training, and buildup of weapons point to a sustained effort to mobilize ideologically motivated violence within Canadian borders. The ideology reportedly driving the group is linked to the so-called sovereign citizen movement, an anti-government belief in which individuals claim that they are not subject to the laws or authority of the state. Some have speculated, given the gun mentality of the group, that gun restriction laws passed by the Liberal government was a bone of contention among the members of the group. Whether this is the one or only one of many catalysts for their actions, it is up for debate, as this is an ongoing investigation and the charges have only been laid recently. While most visible in the United States, elements of this type of movement have seen gathering action and traction in Canada, often overlapping with far-right and conspiracy-driven extremism. This case bears striking resemblance to patterns identified in the recent CSIS annual report. The 2024 CSIS annual report warned of continued rise in ideologically motivated violent extremism, or IMVE, including anti-authoritarian sentiment. It also specifically noted concerns about insider threats and the involvement of individuals with access to weapons, training, and positions of trust, like active military personnel. The presence of 2 serving CAF members among the accused is a critical detail. It raises urgent questions about screening, oversight, and the potential for radicalization within the ranks. While this article does not quote outside analysts, RCMP officials made it clear that the arrests were preemptive, designed to stop the group from executing what police described as a violent plot to forcibly occupy land. My consensus is that there was likely information that the group planned to act immediately and that the RCMP had to act to prevent potential bloodshed. The RCMP emphasized that public safety was at risk and that the individuals had already progressed beyond ideology and into operational planning. I view this case as part of a broader trend, where extremist beliefs, often shaped and accelerated online, are now translating into real-world threats, including inside trusted institutions. When extremists go from rhetoric to reconnaissance, that's when public safety is immediately at risk. The use of social media to communicate and potentially recruit like-minded members to the group is another example of how younger generations of extremists are extending their reach to radicalize others. Domestic terrorism doesn't always wave a flag or broadcast its intent. It can look like a few men in rural Quebec conducting drills and acquiring weapons, until suddenly it doesn't. The fact that 2 of the accused are CAF members makes this an inflection point. It reinforces the need for enhanced monitoring, stronger interagency collaboration, and a whole-of-government approach to countering radicalization, especially within institutions tasked with protecting Canada. It should be remembered that individuals in any community can unfortunately choose to engage in activities that are not reflective of either the values or the focus of that institution. And this is definitely the case here. The Canadian Armed Forces is a proud and honorable pillar of Canadian safety and sovereignty, and the actions of these men are not representative of the vast majority of serving Canadians. However, Canada's national security posture is being tested in the face of this internal ideological threat. I will continue to monitor this story and provide updates as they become available. Okay, let's switch gears for a moment and examine how North Korea's intelligence apparatus continues to adapt in the cyber domain. The U.S. Treasury Department has sanctioned a member of Kim Jong Un's Reconnaissance General Bureau, or RGB, North Korea's top intelligence agency, for orchestrating a global scheme using North Korean IT workers to funnel revenue back to Pyongyang. These workers posed as non-North Korean freelancers to gain access to U.S. and international companies, undermining global sanctions and aiding the regime's weapons development programs. The individual sanctioned, Kim Sang-man, is believed to have facilitated illicit IT contracting work by employing North Korean tech specialists who mask their identities using false documentation and virtual private networks. These freelancers earn substantial income while covertly channeling funds to North Korea's weapons programs. From an intelligence perspective, this is classic asymmetric warfare. North Korea leveraging cyberspace and non-traditional means to outmaneuver international restrictions. What makes this particularly dangerous is the use of legitimate freelance platforms and tech sector vulnerabilities to blend in with the global workforce. It's not a ransomware campaign or obvious hack. It's infiltration through the front door under the guise of business as usual. The Reconnaissance General Bureau is not new to this game. It's the same agency behind the high-profile cyber operations like the Sony Pictures hack in 2014 and suspected involvement in the WannaCry ransomware attacks. But this latest scheme is more covert. Rather than directly attacking, they're embedding operatives in the remote workforce to siphon money and potentially gain access to sensitive infrastructure. The US has warned companies before about North Korean IT workers applying for jobs abroad under aliases. According to past advisories, these workers often target roles in cryptocurrency, blockchain development, and financial services, industries where access means financial disruption or intelligence collection. While the article doesn't quote outside analysts, the U.S. Treasury's action signals clear concern that these types of schemes are expanding. The fact that a named individual tied to Kim's intelligence network is being sanctioned tells us Washington is trying to put a spotlight on the human infrastructure behind North Korea's cyber operations, not just the code. This case reinforces the point that traditional counter-espionage techniques must evolve to catch up to the tactics of Western country adversaries and enemies. It's no longer just about intercepting signals or catching agents in the act. It's about identifying who's behind the keyboard, even if they're halfway around the world and working from a coffee shop with a laptop. This isn't just about North Korea exploiting loopholes. It's about a sanctioned state using its intelligence services to exploit the open, globalized nature of the tech economy. The implications are vast. Cybersecurity, financial compliance, corporate hiring practices, and export control regimes are all affected. As adversaries grow more sophisticated, especially in cyberspace, governments and companies alike will need to invest more heavily in due diligence and digital verification. Because when sanctioned nations like North Korea can pay for missiles with freelance tech gigs, the line between responsible hiring practices and global security is paper thin. We're back in Canada for our next segment, discussing the latest advisory from the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. CSIS has quietly warned federal departments and university that an unnamed individual is actively trying to obtain sensitive Canadian information on behalf of China's intelligence services. According to CSIS, the suspect is engaging targets across government and academia in search of privileged data, precisely the kind that can shorten Beijing's research and development timelines or provide strategic insight into Canada's emerging tech edge. The service has instructed recipients to use extreme caution, limit discussions of confidential material, and report any encounters. Operationally, this is a textbook example of what CSIS calls non-traditional collectors, individuals who may not have formal diplomatic cover yet conduct intelligence tasks on behalf of a foreign service. China remains Canada's top counterintelligence threat. Ottawa has previously prosecuted Yuxing Wang for economic espionage at Hydro-Quebec and dismissed scientists at the National Microbiology Laboratory over PRC security concerns. In their 2024 public report, CSIS highlights Beijing's appetite for AI, quantum computing, biotech, and aerospace, a wish list that mirrors Canada's own areas of expertise. This latest advisory demonstrates a dangerous pattern, targeted harvesting of niche research rather than broad data grabs. CSIS spokespeople rarely confirm operational matters, so public acknowledgement of an espionage advisory is notable. By alerting stakeholders, CSIS hopes to blunt collection efforts and push the suspect into the open, where countermeasures may be easier to execute. Expect heightened security briefings across federal labs and university research hubs. If China's collector is identified and charged, we may see yet another precedent-setting economic espionage case. In the meantime, Canadian institutions, including post-secondary education, should revisit insider threat protocols, reinforce know your client due diligence, and remember that host actors often exploit the very openness that fuels Canadian innovation. I have previously discussed my concerns relating to how colleges and universities, which fall under provincial jurisdiction and profit from large tuition fees from international students, pose a threat to Canada's national security. This is because foreign adversaries like China, Russia, and Iran use these institutions as gateways to Canadian research, technology, and funding. It makes no sense for Canada to proclaim sanctions against Iran on their nuclear program to then turn around and allow Iranian students to access nuclear energy technology courses at established universities because they are willing to pay 5 times more to study in Canada than Canadian students are expected to pay. The provincial educational system needs to stop focusing on international exchange students as cash cows if there is the potential for risk to Canada's national security. Staying on the topic of Chinese espionage, one of my favorites, as everyone knows, let's take a closer look at a new warning from China's Ministry of State Security, or MSS, which claims that foreign intelligence services are actively targeting Chinese nationals with classic recruitment tactics, including seduction, psychological coercion, and threats against family members. This campaign is part of a growing effort by the Chinese government to raise domestic awareness of foreign espionage threats. The MSS alleges that foreign agents are using, quote, honey traps, unquote, in hotels and coercive tactics such as blackmail and intimidation to recruit Chinese citizens living or traveling abroad. One highlighted case involved a Chinese national in Italy who was allegedly lured into an intimate relationship, recorded, and then pressured into gathering intelligence. In another, a student was approached online with offers of money and later threatened when they resisted. These examples are being used to send a public message. Foreign recruitment threats are real, and they start with human vulnerabilities. From an intelligence perspective, this is textbook human source recruitment. The warning itself may be politically convenient for Beijing, especially as it ramps up counterintelligence narratives. But the methods it describes are entirely consistent with how human sources have been recruited for decades. Using seduction, ego stroking, fear, or financial incentives are standard elements in source handling. Intelligence officers often target individuals with access, but also with exploitable psychological weaknesses. What's especially noteworthy here is China's open use of public messaging. Instead of keeping these incidents quiet, they're now turning them into propaganda campaigns, not just to warn, but to instill a sense of suspicion and paranoia. As an authoritarian one-party state, instilling fear in the populace is just another well-used tool in the CCP toolbox. This may also serve to justify increased surveillance and internal controls on students, business travelers, and diaspora communities under the guise of national security. The broader implication is clear. Intelligence services across the world, not just Western agencies, rely heavily on exploiting psychological factors when dealing with human sources. These campaigns remind us that national security threats don't always come through technology or weapons. Often, they come through people and the relationships, fears, and motivations that shape them. For those who are interested in learning more about the psychology behind human sources and intelligence, I teach a one-day online course at the University of Ottawa on just this topic. With over 25 years of intelligence and law enforcement experience, I provide deep insight to the motivational factors surrounding human source recruitment, how it works, and what happens when things go wrong. I'll leave a link in the show notes and the transcript if you want to check it out and sign up. Chinese spies here, Chinese spies there. I report on Chinese spies everywhere. For our next story, we're focusing on a growing tension between China and Ukraine, following the arrest of 2 Chinese nationals accused of attempting to gather intelligence on Ukraine's Neptune missile program. The Ukrainian Security Service, known as the SBU, claims the individuals were acting on behalf of the Chinese intelligence organizations. The case has quickly gained international attention, with China responding cautiously and calling for clarification while asserting its intention to protect the rights of its citizens. According to Ukrainian authorities, the first suspect is a 24-year-old former student who allegedly attempted to acquire sensitive technical documents related to the Neptune missile system. He was reportedly caught in the act, and subsequent investigation led to the arrest of his father, who was believed to have been involved in facilitating or overseeing the operation. Ukraine's Neptune missile system has been a key strategic asset since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. It is believed that these missiles played a role in striking Russia's naval targets, including the much-publicized hit on the Moskva warship. That makes the Neptune program an obvious, high-value target for hostile intelligence services. From an intelligence perspective, this reflects a common and growing trend: the recruitment of students, researchers, and dual nationals to gain access to restricted defense or technology information. These individuals often have legitimate reasons for travel and access to academic or technical environments, making them ideal candidates for recruitment or coercion. This case marks the first known arrest of Chinese nationals for espionage in Ukraine since the war began. While China has attempted to maintain a publicly neutral stance on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the West has increasingly accused Beijing of tactically supporting Moscow, particularly through the transfer of dual-use technology and possible intelligence coordination. This incident could have ripple effects beyond the immediate diplomatic fallout. It highlights the vulnerability of Ukraine's sensitive military programs and raises questions about broader counterintelligence practices in countries facing ongoing conflict. It also underscores the importance of scrutinizing foreign nationals working in or around critical infrastructure and defense programs. This is a wake-up call for any defense contractors or the Canadian government who are looking to shore up our own military capacity. Security officials have raised concerns that China may be increasing its intelligence gathering efforts in Eastern Europe, not only to monitor the war's progress, but also to exploit new military developments and technologies being tested on the battlefield. A concern that I have revolves around how Russia is now outsourcing their intelligence requirements to China, and most likely North Korea. This is a true game changer and indicates that a new era of intelligence collaboration on the collection front for Russia and China. This means that China and Russia have brokered a high-level intelligence gathering exchange, and they have become a force multiplier in the intelligence operations against Western countries. With current trade tariffs and economic global uncertainty potentially slowing the cooperation between allied Western nations, this leaves all of us more vulnerable. The arrest has sparked debate about the potential for broader espionage operations and the long-term risks posed by foreign access to sensitive programs in Ukraine and other allied nations. Professionally speaking, this is a textbook example of strategic intelligence targeting. It demonstrates how military innovation in active war zones becomes a magnet for adversarial collection efforts, and how intelligence services continue to exploit personal and academic channels to achieve their goals. The arrest of these 2 Chinese nationals is more than a bilateral issue. It's a reflection of the global intelligence contest unfolding in the shadows of the Ukraine war. As countries like China and Russia look to gather advantage in real-time conflicts, we can expect more attempts to infiltrate, monitor, and exfiltrate information from frontline nations. It also places added pressure on Ukraine, its allies and supporters, like Canada, to harden their counterintelligence practices and improve international coordination. For our last story this week, we examined a growing concern in Western capitals: Russia's escalating sabotage campaign across Europe. The Associated Press this week reported that Russia is increasingly relying on covert operations, including arson and sabotage, to target Western military infrastructure and disrupt support for Ukraine. These acts are believed to be orchestrated by Russian intelligence services and carried out using proxies, often recruited from migrant communities or organized crime groups. This signals a dangerous intensification of gray zone tactics that many Western governments are now starting to acknowledge more openly. The article highlights a string of incidents over the past year, fires, vandalism, and attempted attacks on military or logistic hubs that officials in the UK, Germany, Poland, and other NATO countries suspect are being linked to Russian intelligence. These actions are subtle but strategic, setting fire to warehouses, damaging rail lines, and attempting to disable supply chains that funnel weapons and support for Ukraine. The attackers are often locals or foreign nationals with no formal ties to the Kremlin, making attribution difficult and allowing Russia plausible deniability. This is classic hybrid warfare. When Moscow can't match NATO militarily, it turns to sabotage, disinformation, and covert action to achieve strategic goals while staying below the threshold of direct conflict. What we're seeing is a calculated effort to stretch Western security services, spread fear, and undercut Ukraine's war effort by disrupting logistics and sowing internal distrust within Europe. The shift towards physical sabotage builds on a long-standing Russian playbook. From the Soviet era to present day, Moscow has used subversion and covert action to destabilize adversaries. But since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, there's been a marked escalation. Just this year, authorities in the UK and Germany arrested several suspects accused of plotting attacks on behalf of Russian intelligence. It's important to compare this to other trends in gray zone warfare, such as suspected Russian involvement in cutting undersea cables or the widespread disinformation campaigns targeting Western elections. What sets this apart is the reemergence of kinetic sabotage operations on European soil, coordinated not by uniformed officers, but by these covert proxies. The article quotes European intelligence officials who warned that this is no longer a fringe tactic. It's becoming a central pillar of Russia's war strategy. They point to a growing pattern of Russian spy services outsourcing sabotage to criminals, ideologically motivated actors, or those easily manipulated with financial incentives. This totally fits the Russian intelligence community's MO. They understand that in open democracies, there are more opportunities to exploit vulnerabilities, whether through disinformation, corruption, or recruitment of assets. And while Western governments are getting better at tracking cyber threats, physical acts of sabotage are harder to predict, and even harder to prevent. As I have previously referenced, Canada continues support and provision of funds and arms to Ukraine, and this makes us vulnerable to Russian sabotage tactics. As wildfire season continues to rage and Canadians lose homes, businesses, and potentially their lives, I can't help but think that some of the started fires could be the result of a Russian proxy firebug agent. Russia's sabotage campaign in Europe is more than a series of isolated incidents. It's part of a broader hybrid strategy aimed at weakening NATO's resolve to support Ukraine. These operations challenge the capacity of law enforcement and intelligence services. They blur the line between crime and espionage and remind us that the battlefield now includes civilian infrastructure, logistical networks, and public morale. Western nations must respond with better counterintelligence, greater resilience, and coordinated public awareness campaigns. As we've seen before, the failure to connect these dots early can have dangerous and deadly consequences. So, another week, another glimpse into the shadowy world of intelligence. As always, the links to the open source media articles are in the transcript. I want to inform my listeners that I started providing weekly commentary on Substack. My most recent article is entitled, "Canada is playing defense with no offense and we're losing the game." It goes into why Canada needs a standalone foreign human service and is available for free. Please consider subscribing to my Substack for more articles and access to this podcast. And remember, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.
That wraps up this week's Global Intelligence Weekly Wrap-Up. From armed extremists inside Canada's own military to North Korean cyber operations, Chinese espionage, and Russian sabotage in Europe, this week's stories show that the threats we face are real, growing, and increasingly complex. This podcast takes time, effort, and hard-won experience to produce, and it exists for one reason: to help you stay aware and be prepared. If today's episode gave you valuable insight, please take a moment to like, share, and leave a review. It helps others find the show and strengthens our growing community of informed listeners. And if you'd like to support this critical mission, you can do so through becoming a supporter at Buzzsprout or Patreon. Your support helps keep the podcast remain strong, sharp, independent, and focused on the intelligence that matters most. The world can be a dangerous place, but understanding the threats is the first step toward preparing for them. Until next time, and as Neil always reminds us, stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe.